Ever feel like government agencies are just out there to collect taxes no matter what?
Yeah.
Today's deep dive might surprise you.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at the Supreme Court case where a government agency actually got a tax refund.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Basis Conversion and Development Authority, or BCDA, sold some prime real estate and argued the earnings weren't taxable income at all.
That's interesting. What's fascinating is that the entire case hinges on whether the BCDA's special charter overrides the general tax laws.
Yeah.
It really gets into the nitty-gritty of how these legal principles clash.
Okay, let's break this down.
Sure.
First, what's the official name of this case, and who are the main players?
So this case is officially titled Commissioner of Internal Revenue versus Basis Conversion and Development Authority, with the case number GR-217898, decided on January 15th, 2020.
Gotcha.
As you might guess, it's the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, essentially the head of the tax collection agency, versus the BCDA.
So the taxman versus the folks in charge of redeveloping former U.S. military bases.
Exactly.
That's an interesting matchup. Could you remind us what the BCDA does exactly?
So the BCDA is tasked with converting former U.S. military bases into productive civilian use.
Okay.
Think prime real estate, business districts, even nature reserves.
Right.
This particular case focuses on land they sold in Fort Bonifacio.
Okay.
An extremely valuable area in Metro Manila.
Ah, Fort Bonifacio. We're talking prime real estate here.
Yes.
So what exactly happened? Did the BCDA sell the land and the taxman came knocking?
Pretty much. The BCDA sold a portion of land called the Expanded Big Delta Lots to a group of companies known as the Net Group for over 2 billion pesos.
Wow.
Now, standard practice in these big transactions is for the buyer to withhold a portion for taxes.
Right.
In this case, the Net Group withheld over 101 million pesos.
Okay.
It's Creditable Withholding Tax, or CWT.
Okay, so far it sounds like a normal real estate deal.
Yeah.
Where does the conflict come in?
Here's where it gets interesting. The BCDA claimed they were exempt from paying taxes on this sale.
Really?
Citing their own charter, Republic Act 7227, as amended by Republic Act 7917, also known as the Basis Conversion and Development Act of 1992.
So they're saying, hey, taxman, we play by our own rules.
Exactly. They argued the money wasn't typical income, but rather public funds earmarked for specific purposes outlined in their charter.
I'm guessing the taxman wasn't too happy about potentially losing out on over 100 million pesos?
You guessed right. The CIR denied the BCDA's request for a refund of that withheld CWT.
Oh, wow.
And thus began the legal battle.
So they took the taxman to court.
They did. The first stop was the Court of Tax Appeals, or CTA.
So did the CTA side with the taxman or the BCDA?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
The CTA First Division actually ruled in favor of the BCDA.
Wow. So the tax court sided with the BCDA.
Yes.
What was their reasoning?
They focused on the specific wording in the BCDA's charter, particularly Section 8 of RA 7227, which outlines how funds from these particular land sales should be used.
Right.
The court emphasized this section's clear statement that these proceeds were exempt from all forms of taxes and fees.
So the law itself seemed to provide the exemption.
Precisely. This is where the idea of special law versus general law comes into play.
Okay.
The National Internal Revenue Code, or NIRC, is the general law for taxes in the Philippines. But the BCDA's charter, as a special law, creates a specific exception to those general rules.
It's like the NIRC is the rule book, but the BCDA has a special pass that lets them bypass some of the rules.
That's a great way to put it. The CTA emphasized that because the BCDA's charter directly addressed these funds, it took precedence over the general provisions of the NIRC.
Right.
But, as you can imagine, the CIR wasn't ready to give up.
I bet they weren't. What happened next?
The CIR appealed, taking the case all the way to the Supreme Court.
Wow.
The key question before the highest court: was the BCDA truly exempt from the CWT on the sale of its global city properties?
So the stage was set, taxman versus the BCDA at the Supreme Court. What happened next?
Well, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the lower court's decisions, ruling in favor of the BCDA. They found the agency was indeed exempt from paying the creditable withholding tax on that land sale.
3 courts in a row siding with the BCDA.
Yeah.
I'm impressed. What was the Supreme Court's logic?
Their decision, like the lower courts, hinged on Section 8 of RA 7227.
Right.
As amended by RA 7970. They emphasized its clear language, stating that proceeds from those specific land sales were exempt from all forms of taxes and fees. Essentially, they said the law was so clear that there was no need for complex interpretation.
So they basically said the law says what it says, end of story.
Exactly. This highlights the legal principle of statutory interpretation.
Okay.
When a law is clear, the court simply applies it as written.
Right.
The Supreme Court's decision emphasizes the importance of precise language in lawmaking.
It makes you wonder how many legal battles could be avoided with clearer laws. But back to this case.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court also distinguished between public funds and income, right?
Yes, that's another key point.
Okay.
They determined that the money from these land sales wasn't typical income for the BCDA. Instead, it was categorized as public funds already allocated for specific purposes by law.
So public funds are treated differently when it comes to taxes.
That's what this case highlights. The Supreme Court affirmed that certain government funds, especially those earmarked for specific public purposes, might be exempt from standard taxation rules.
It's fascinating how this case reviews the nuances of government finances. But beyond the legal back and forth, what does this mean for the average person?
It reminds us that even simple transactions like selling land can have complex legal implications, especially when government agencies are involved. Understanding the specific rules governing different entities and transactions is crucial.
So we've covered the background, the facts, the lower court's decisions, the Supreme Court's issue, and their ruling. What else should we unpack from this case?
We should highlight some key legal principles that came into play.
Okay.
For instance, the special law versus general law concept we discussed earlier.
Right, like that special pass we talked about.
Exactly.
So the BCDA's charter, being the specific law, trumped the general tax code.
Yes.
What other legal concepts were involved?
Statutory interpretation was also central. The Supreme Court stuck to the plain language of the law, emphasizing clarity. They essentially rejected any attempts to reinterpret or read between the lines.
Okay.
This was a win for textualism, the idea that the actual text of a law is paramount.
It seems like the Supreme Court was saying, let's stick to what the law actually says. Any other important legal takeaways?
The distinction between public funds and income is significant. The Supreme Court's classification of those funds as public, not just regular income for the BCDA, was crucial. They were seen as pre-designated for specific purposes outlined in the BCDA charter.
This distinction definitely impacted how those funds were taxed. It also makes us think about how we view the financial operations of government agencies, particularly those working on projects for public benefit.
Absolutely. It raises questions about how much financial flexibility these agencies should have versus the need for oversight and accountability. It's a complex intersection of law, public policy, and government operations.
This case has been a roller coaster ride through the legal system.
Definitely.
It's amazing how a single case can reveal so much about how government agencies work and the legal principles that guide their actions.
What's fascinating to me is how this case demonstrates the balance between legislative intent, how agencies actually operate, and the overall legal framework. It's a reminder that even seemingly straightforward transactions can have profound legal implications.
This deep dive has truly been an eye-opener. Who knew land sales could be so legally intriguing?
What I find particularly interesting is the interplay between legislative intent, agency operations, and the legal framework governing it all. It's a reminder that even seemingly straightforward transactions can have deep legal implications.
This case really makes you think. For our listener, what are some key takeaways they could apply to their own understanding of these issues?
This case really underscores the importance of understanding the nuances of specific laws, especially when it comes to government agencies and projects. It's not always as simple as looking at general tax laws. Sometimes specific agencies have unique rules based on their charters or mandates.
So knowledge is power, especially when it comes to navigating the legal landscape. Anything else our listeners should keep in mind?
This case highlights the unique nature of certain government funds. Money generated by an agency isn't always treated as regular income subject to standard taxes. If funds are specifically designated for certain public purposes, they might be exempt.
That's a really important distinction to understand. Any other final thoughts for our listener before we wrap up?
This case is a great example of the principle of statutory interpretation, which focuses on the plain language of the law. The Supreme Court's decision emphasizes that when the wording is clear and unambiguous, there's no need for creative interpretation. Clarity in legal language matters.
This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. We've learned about the BCDA, the nuances of government finances, and key legal principles at play. What are your final thoughts on this case?
For me, the most intriguing aspect is how this case reveals the tension between legislative intent, agency operations, and the legal framework governing it all. It reminds us that even seemingly straightforward transactions can have deep legal implications.
This case really makes you think. Did anything about this case surprise you? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and favorite this episode. And of course, subscribe to The Deep Dive for more fascinating insights.
We'll see you in the next deep dive.